Well, welcome to Harvard on this very lovely St. Patrick's Day. I hope you all got wet and blessed. Having grown up Catholic, I felt like I should do the genuflection because of the rain. So anyway, all right, well, welcome to Harvard. And so I am representing the Human Flourishing Program. And one of the things the Human Flourishing Program is doing actively today is a global flourishing study across 22 countries, over 200,000 participants. It's a largest study of its kind. It's a 5-year process where it's called a longitudinal study, and pretty much represents everybody in the world. And so we're looking at all kinds of dimensions of flourishing. And my topic of interest and research is actually being reflected in the study. The first year results, we saw a lot of childhood adversity impacting long-term health outcomes. So it's pervasive, it's an issue, and I'm glad to be able to speak to you about it today. Okay, so I like to start off with this title, ACE in the Whole. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And in your packet today, there's a card, and it looks like this. It's got a little child on it, and it says ACE is aware. So I'd like for you to draw that out, because that's a big part of my presentation today. Okay, so if you take a moment and find that. Okay, so what is an ACE, and why should you care? So ACE is about childhood trauma. And you're saying, well, we're here to talk about veterans. These people have retired, they've done their service. Why should we be talking about childhood trauma? Well, childhood trauma is a leading indicator for suicide and self-harm. And so I'm here today to talk about that because it's not something that you hear a lot. And I haven't been able to find any studies that have been done in the military or veterans on ACEs. And so we're gonna hopefully correct that soon. So ACEs are, there's 10 items that we use commonly in research and in clinical practice to look at what is ACEs. So it's any type of adversity that happens before the age of 18. There is what we call a dose-response relationship. So that means the higher number of ACEs that you have, the poorer health outcomes you have across your life, okay? And that includes mental health and physical health. And what happened is in the late 90s, Kaiser Permanente was seeing some interesting trends in their mental health patients, and they did a big study. They pulled about 20,000 patient records, and then they executed what we call this ACEs survey. They developed it, the CDC, and the results were stunning. It was overwhelming evidence. They compared it to everybody's health records, and they found that if you had an certain level of ACE scores, it impacted not only your mental health, alcoholism, drug abuse, all types of mental health disorders, but also you had much higher rates of cardiovascular events, diabetes, and cancer as well. And so if you are a veteran or anybody who would like to kind of take this survey today, there should also be a pen in your bag, and you can check off the boxes. If you want to talk to me afterwards, I'm happy to talk to you if you have questions about it, but it really covers anything from emotional abuse and bullying, physical abuse or violence, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, housing or food insecurity, a parent that's separated or divorced, domestic violence, a parent imprisoned, and a household member with a mental health disorder or a problem with drugs and alcohol. And we used to think that was primarily because of genetics. The people, you have a genetic predisposition to alcohol. That's not why. That's part of the reason, but that's not why. Okay, so what is going on when you experience a trauma? You have a stress response. And if you're a child living in a dysfunctional environment and you're being routinely bullied or abused, or if there's domestic violence going on in your home, you're going to be stressed. And what the research has found, many research studies, longitudinal, very strong studies, have looked at what's happening. And as a child, if your stress response goes on, and most of us have heard of the fight or flight syndrome, when you're stressed, when you feel when your life is at threat or somebody else's life is being threatened, your body reacts. And as a child, your brain is developing. And when you have high levels of stress, it impacts the brain development. It has severe impacts on the brain. And so we call this toxic stress. And if there's a mediator, like if there's a buffer zone or somebody, the child is just stressed for a very short time and there's a parent they can go to or somebody they can talk to, it tends to mitigate or reduce the stress and it has a less impact. But that's often not the case when you're experiencing dysfunction in your environments. And so toxic stress is, and I can't read that far away, but it impacts the what we call the HPA axis, which is the stress response system. It dysregulates that. So in other words, the stress stays on all the time, and what's happening is your body is circulating cortisol and adrenaline and all these hormones, and it damages the brain, and it's permanent. So it reduces the volume of the brain, and impacts the prefrontal cortex, it has impacts on the amygdala. It changes the way that the neurons connect to one another, so your ability to manage your serotonin and dopamine or express those things are changed. It even changes the gene expression, so we call that epigenetics. Okay? So when you're exposed to high levels of stress in childhood, this sets you up for your entire life to have I call a stress intolerance. That means your ability to tolerate stress goes way down. And so you get stressed more easily. You get triggered more easily. Okay, so what happens? Many studies have shown that a dose-response relationship, which is the higher number of ACEs, impacts your health. So just as an example, an individual with an ACE score of 6 or more has a 4,600% increase in the likelihood of later using intravenous drugs. Okay? An individual with an ACE score of 4 or more is 460% more likely to be depressed and 1,220% increase in attempted suicide. 4 or more ACEs. So if you can check off 4 or more of these boxes, okay, that starts to increase your risk. It's pretty significant, okay? And there's many other disorders that are related to stress. So anxiety, PTSD, as we know. But if you had a childhood experience, your vulnerability in service is going to be much higher. You're going to be at much higher risk than the rest of the population. Okay, so here's an example of a few other indicators. We see drug use. You can see if you have 6 or more, if you look at these little lines, if you look at these little lines over here, that means that it's a much higher percentage. Okay, so drug use, depressed effect, suicide attempt, heavy drinking. Do we have drinking problems with people with veterans? How about active service members? Okay, so this is what's going on with people with ACEs. Very significant. Okay, another very alarming study, what toxic stress does to the brain. This is a study that was done on patients with psychosis that had a history of trauma in ACEs. So if you can see here is a normal brain, and this is what it looks like if you had toxic stress. The brain has changed, okay? And so this is a really great study that was done. I'm trying to remember who did it. Mayo, Corey, very significant findings. Okay, so here's what's going on. So first of all, we do have a genetic vulnerabilities to mental health. And some folks will say, well, it's genetics. It doesn't matter, it's just genetics. But it actually does matter, because what we've seen in studies is that if you have ACEs, even if you have protective genes, there's some genes that can protect you, if you have high enough ACEs, the ACEs will compromise those genes. So you still are at risk, okay? So what happens is you have some genetic vulnerability, you have the trauma, then it alters the brain, which impacts many things throughout your childhood and into high school. So this is why when we struggle, people are getting into fights, they're getting depressed, they're having some mental health problems, and people are thinking, oh, it's an adjustment disorder, or they just don't know how to get along, or they're not. No, it's actually their brain has changed, and so they're predisposed and they're struggling, and nobody's figured it out. And so then they can also start having psychotic-like experiences. This is like at the extreme. This is for people that are at the extreme end. And then when you have psychotic-like experiences, you're then more vulnerable to more trauma. Because if you're not able to get a job, or you're living in a compromised environment, we call it the strain theory. So you're more likely to have more trauma. okay? And it's just a continuous cycle. Now, all the damage is not done in childhood, but if you have a higher stress response, once you're deployed, if you don't understand what's going on and you get triggers, you're not knowing that's why your body's getting so overstressed or overtaxed. Well, now you're getting more stress, and that's continuing to add to the damage that's being done to the brain. It doesn't stop in childhood. So it's compounded, and it starts to accelerate as we age. Okay, so what does stress do? Well, any of us know if we're having a really stressed day, these are some things that start to happen. Memory problems, get foggy, inability to concentrate, poor judgment, anxious or racing thoughts, constant worrying, seeing only the negative. Can anybody relate to any of this? This is what happens. If you have ACEs, this is your life on steroids. This is like it every day. My ACE score is 7. So this is my life every day. I have to practice strategies to manage my stress, because even when I'm supposedly at peace, my brain is turned on. It can't turn off. This is what it's like living with stress. And we think about stress, oh yeah, I'm having a stress out day. If you're managing this all the time, and this is going on inside your body, and you're getting all these different things coming at you all the time, at some point it can become too much. It's just like, how do you cope? How do you manage? And if you don't know or understand that this is why, and you get taught strategies on how to mitigate it, it becomes overwhelming. Okay, so what happens as an adult? PTSD, anger, moral injury, anxiety, depression, irritability, instability, self-destructive, emotional instability, anger, insomnia, lots of insomnia, substance use. This is all the stuff that happens. Marital problems. Does anybody have any marital problems? So numbing. So people respond to stress in different ways. Okay, but these are all things that happen for adults that have really been untreated. And even if you've been treated, you can still have some of these challenges. Okay. So this is from the same psychotic study, but I really like this slide because it talks about stress vulnerability. So when we look at stress vulnerability, if you have high levels of stress and you're starting to have more symptoms, your threshold's going down. So your ability to withstand stress just goes down and keeps decreasing and decreasing and decreasing over time. Okay. So ACEs are common. About 64% of the population has at least one ACE. Okay, 17% has 4 or more ACEs. What do we think is the rate in the military? Anybody want to hazard a guess? This is a classroom, so I'm going to engage with you now. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Throw out a number. What's the percentage in the military of ACEs? 60%. How much? 60? You nailed it. Now, I'm going to say I don't have data to prove it. It's anecdotal. I haven't seen any studies published because they don't measure it. There's been a few people who have done some pilot programs. I haven't seen it measures. I haven't been able to find any measures. And so I've had lots of discussions. And when I talk with people in the military, 50, 60% is what they say. I can't prove it right now. Hopefully someday I will. But 4 or more ACEs, and it's actually even higher numbers of ACEs than 4. Okay, it's like 5 or 6 ACEs. And this is among enlisted personnel. And this was one, I'm not going to mention the branch, but it's one specific branch, but I'm sure there's others as well. And just from a small pilot that was done in one base, that was the number that came up. So when we think about ACEs, it's a serious issue, and there's not really right now any solid research. There's not programs to train people like, well, you have ACEs, here's what to expect. Okay, so I'll tell you a little story because I have a few minutes. I think you guys have to flag me off when it's time. But my brother, my family member, I grew up in a kind of a family of poverty, and both my brothers were molested by our parish priest when they were young boys, and we didn't find out till they were in their 20s. And so along with all the other stuff they were dealing with, they were both abused. And my brother Patrick, he, in his public story, so it's been published, he really struggled with gangs in high school and drugs and alcohol. But he got into the military, he got into the Marines, and it was the proudest day of his entire life. And I have pictures of him marching off with his beautiful uniform. And about a year later, he was generally discharged because of his problems with alcohol. And part of the challenge wasn't necessarily he was going to be an alcoholic his entire life, but it had to do with the fact that he was in a base and his job was to sweep the floors. Now this kid was brilliant. He was really brilliant. He could have gone to college had he not had ACEs and lost his father and been abused and all these things. But he just felt like his life wasn't worthwhile, so he started drinking again. And he got washed out. And he struggled his entire life. He's been able to maintain a job now for 20 years as a phlebotomist, but he's in rehab today as we speak. He called me about 2 weeks ago saying he was in trouble and he needed help. And I've been talking to him about my research and trying to help him with his overall sense of self, because he just feels so bad. And he once said, I feel like such a loser. I'm such a loser dad. And he's, really struggled. And I'm like, no, this is your brain. You need to understand it's not you. And it didn't believe me. Well, this rehab that he's in now, Miracles of Miracles, they are a trauma-informed rehab center. And he called me, he said, this is the best place I've ever been. And they have this book, and they're talking about neuroplasticity and all the stuff that goes on with ACEs and all these things. And he goes, I don't feel like such a loser anymore. And I started to cry, which I'm going to do now. But anyway, so if we can catch these guys early and we can educate them, doesn't mean that you can't go in the military, because the other thing is about ACEs, I'm 7, and I'm here at Harvard now. We also have superpowers. There's things that we're really, really good at. And so if you can find those things and harness that strength, and if you can harness the good parts of these poor kids that were abused, nothing that they did on their own, then they got in trouble because they're angry or agitated, or they have prefrontal cortex damage that makes them more irritable and makes it harder for them to regulate their emotions. If you can teach them the right skills and let them know that this is what's going on, so they can marry what's going on with them now to why they're acting the way they are and how they can fix it, you'll have a much better outcome and hopefully less suicide. Okay, so about moral injury, it's a big topic now. So I led research a couple years ago to say, moral injury is not just about victims and perpetrators, it's also about perpetrators and witnesses, it's about victims as well. And many rape victims experience moral injury because they have a lot of shame and a lot of blame, and they think that they did something themselves. And so we convened a task force here at Harvard for 2 years. We researched it, and we came up with an expanded definition. And so then we said, this needs to be in the DSM because we need to gather data, because there's not a lot of good data. There's a few studies out there people do on special populations, but we don't have wide data. And so as of December, the APA accepted our proposal, and it's now an official, what we call Z code. They put it under moral problems. It's part of religious and spiritual problems. So now you can actually code as of today. It's going to be published in the September version, which they update every year as a TR. And but this is what moral problems is, and it comes right from our definition of moral injury. So it says religious, the category is actually about moral or religious or spiritual problems, and a moral problem includes experiences that disrupt one's understanding of right and wrong or sense of goodness of oneself, others, or institutions. Okay, and so again, moral injury, we hear about it. Oh, I went in service and I saw something I didn't agree with, and that bothered me, and ultimately had moral injury. It's typically something that triggered them that they're reflecting on from when they're childhood, and they're not able to resolve it because maybe they saw this horrible thing happen to their mother or sister, or it happened to them. And now they've been indoctrinated, they come into the military and they think, well, I'm gonna save lives, I'm gonna do good things, and then they see something bad, and it just completely shatters their illusions of themselves in the military, and it causes this dissonance. And when you add that to people who have a compromised amygdala and prefrontal cortex, all these other problems, it just starts to swim in their brains, and it just creates this toxic soup. So they have a hard time resolving it. So ACEs is been associated. There's some studies that have been associated with moral injury, just a couple of them, but I'm hoping there'll be more. There was a Canadian study, and they found that a higher percentage of people with moral injury had ACEs, childhood trauma, and the same with PTSD. And then there was also a study on first responders. So I did a 3-hour presentation in about 15 minutes. I hope that made sense for all of you. And really great having you guys today. There are some things that you can do to heal this problem. And for me, the best thing is exercise. I've been in autotherapy since I was, in my teens. And once you resolve all the conflict, that doesn't fix the neurological problems you have with hyperactivity and the brain and some of the things you're doing. You have to find other ways to address that. And unfortunately, most in the mental health profession, it's not a real holistic approach. So they'll treat you one way, but they won't tell you that if you change your diet and exercise, you'll get better sleep and you'll be able to control your anxiety. It's not about pills. There's no pills that really will help. And so it's about lifestyle. And so you have to exercise, get good sleep, proper nutrition, and there's a whole host of other things that help improve outcomes, having to do building resilience. Mindfulness practices are really good, except individuals with trauma, meditation is counterindicated. And many of the programs for suicide prevention are using meditation and mindfulness. It has to be trauma-informed meditation and mindfulness. If you sit with a still mind, if you try to still your mind and you have a hyperactive brain and you're trying to calm it, it doesn't work. You can't do it. So there's specific techniques for people with ACEs that you can use for mindfulness and meditation. Most people don't know about that. What else? Let's see. Nature walks, very helpful. Hobbies, really great. Any creative expression, it gauges part of your brain, it releases dopamine, it really helps to soothe some of those problems. Religious service attendance, that's been very helpful for me, a place to be peaceful, and focusing on individual social skills. So when we talk about isolation, people aren't isolated necessarily because they don't have somebody to talk to. It's because they don't want to go talk to people. And they're still struggling so much with what's going on inside. They've been betrayed by people they don't trust. And so it's difficult. So we have to get that resolved and then get them with what we call peers. So peers are people with lived experience who've been through it, who can actually talk to them, who understand. So that's another important part. It's not necessarily bringing in other people who are doing really great that can't relate to you. That's not going to help. It's the people that have been where you're at, that have gone through recovery. That's the people that can help you. And then focusing on being proactive, of course. And then another big part is forgiveness. And so there's a program that we've done a ton amount of research on at Harvard. It was developed by a professor at Everett Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth University. And it's called The Path to Reach Forgiveness. And it's about letting go, and it's a process for helping you let go. And when I wrote a book about my family's experience with clergy abuse, and somebody read it and said, well, I don't understand how you could forgive the church. It's one of the most horrible things that could ever happen. And I said, there's no other choice. And when we did, 2 years ago, we got a World Day passed at the United Nations to prevent child abuse and child sexual abuse and bring healing to survivors. And many in the industry wanted the word justice in the title, and I didn't put it in there. I put healing in. And I got a lot of flack for that. But there's no justice for a stolen childhood. There's no justice. And many people that have been abused by a parent or somebody. There's just no justice. We're going to put them in prison, and the family's going to starve. And so we need to do prevention. But at some point, you have to let it go, and you have to heal. So that's my talk today, and very glad to be here. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And hopefully I'll get to meet some of you at the break. And how much time do we have? Are we done? Am I out of time? Yep, I'm out of time. Okay, no time for questions, but you can ask me questions at the break. I'm happy to answer, and very grateful to have you all here today. Thank you.